Episode of Conversing Labs. This is a podcast from the team here at Reversing Labs, where we dig into the latest developments in areas like malware analysis, threat hunting, threat intelligence, and also software supply chain security. I'm Carolynn van Arsdale. I'm your host for today's episode. I manage all kinds of content here at Reversing Labs, and today I am thrilled to welcome on two guests. First, we have Professor Laurie Williams and also Ph.D. student Sivana Hamer, both from the university, or excuse me, North Carolina State University.
Oh yeah,
From the
don't make that mistake.
NC State, also referred to, from the computer science department. Professor Williams is a Goodnight Distinguished University Professor in Security Sciences, who also co-directs the NC State Secure Computing Institute. With more than 260 publications, Professor Williams has published research on various software topics, such as software security, agile software development, and software reliability. Her advisee, Sivana, is a third-year computer science PhD student currently researching the state of software supply chain security. Recent research efforts of hers include how software dependency changes have been tracked, as well as vulnerabilities compared between ChatGPT and Stack Overflow. Very interesting stuff. So, Professor Williams and Sivana, welcome to Conversing Labs. It's wonderful to have you both on today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, of course. So we always do this with new guests on the show. We ask you to kind of give your elevator pitch of who you are, how you're involved in cybersecurity, and today we're talking about software supply chain security. So I'd love to hear more about that. So Professor Williams, let's go ahead and start with you, please. Would love to hear more about your academic career, how you settled on security sciences, and what you find so interesting about software supply chain security.
Sure, thanks. So as you mentioned, I'm a professor in the computer science department at NC State, where I've been for 25 years. I can't believe I can say that. But really, I didn't take a traditional path to academia. I started out at IBM and worked as an industrial engineer at IBM and got an MBA during that time. So it just shows people's paths can be very sorted. So eventually I got a PhD in computer science after I had 3 babies, so not the normal path. And because I really wanted to be an academic. So I felt it at that time, and so I took that step. And as an academic, I really did quickly zone in on software security. And the reason is because I truly have a passion for helping save the world from cyber criminals. It's absolutely a passion that I have. And so teaching students to do the same and mentoring PhD students so they can then go out into the world and do the same brings a lot of passion to me. So that's how I got where I am.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I really admire, and I think I hear this story a lot when speaking with folks in academia and professors, hearing how they moved from industry into academia, bringing those real world lessons into your work and, building that passion for securing the world. Very cool. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
So Sivana, let's turn to you. So you've been focused on the state of software supply chain security. I'd love to hear more about your academic journey and your research interests and where it's taken you.
Yeah, so I guess my journey's a bit shorter at this point still, but basically, I guess I started doing research during my undergrad and master's like, in Costa Rica, actually, which is pretty cool. I was actually very interested in a field that we have in like research called like empirical software engineering. So it's basically using like real data to like inform what's happening in these like different software processes because software is like everywhere and it's like super important. And I really also like measurement, which is a very like specific topic within like empirical software engineering. So it's sort of like how can you measure stuff? And I ended up working with Laurie because she's really, really well known in the field of empirical software engineering. And I've now become involved in software security and software supply chain because, again, it's like something that like people really care about, and I've really grown to love it. It's really cool to like work on problems that like people like care about, and every day, they're like facing these challenges, and it's really cool, I guess, like as a student to be able to like try to help them, right, to make a world a better place overall.
Yeah, very well said. I think too, and I'll definitely ask you both about this regarding software supply chain security, because of course, cybersecurity has been around for, 30 years, 30 plus years. I feel like software supply chain security, on the other hand, obviously it's been around, software's been around, but talking about it in general discourse, seeing it in the news, it's newer, right?
Mhm.
And especially as you pointed out, academic research in this area is extremely important in addition to other
Mhm.
cybersecurity topics.
Mhm.
Can you both just share for me why academic research is so essential for software supply chain security, especially where we are now with the current threat landscape?
Sure. I mean, I guess I can go first. I won't always go
Mhm.
first, Sivana.
Okay.
I became interested in software supply chain security really because a student of mine was interested in software supply chain security. And as you say, it's a relatively new topic. And so and I'll give a shout out to Nassif. I'm Tiaz, who works at Google now. And in 2019, he really became interested in this. 80% of all software is open source. And so he started to work on looking at the security release of open source packages, a comparison of SCA tools before SCA tools were cool, code review coverage, contributor reputation metrics. He had been involved with all of these things before SolarWinds, before everyone's focused on software supply chain security. And so, he really did bring it to focus with me, and we were really getting a lot of momentum when SolarWinds happened in late 2020. The executive order happened in 2021. And so, we were well on our way. And we did get a large National Science Foundation grant, which I can talk more about later. But as part of that, we run 3 software supply chain summits with industry and government. And they do say that, so the practitioners are saying that, they're just trying to survive. They're trying to put out products. They're trying to do whatever they can do to not be the victim of an attack, and that there is a need for fundamental research to find solutions to software supply chain security. And so, I agree, and that's really what motivates me to be involved with academic research in software supply chain security.
I think adding a bit more to that, right? I think that like us as academics have a very different like skill set than like industry, and they're both valuable, like definitely in government, right? I think like everybody in this field like sort of benefits from like different perspectives and different ways that we solve problems, right? Because again, like as academics, we don't have as much power as like to influence, what's happening or like to adopt stuff, but we do have some like skill sets of like how can we like research stuff in a very using a lot of methods, and like making it like very like scientific and academically rigorous that can help I guess policymakers or software organizations have like data that backs it up. So I think it's like a field that we also all benefit from helping each other a lot, which has been like super exciting that everyone, at least that I've usually interacted with, is like super nice and like super inviting. And
Yeah, well said. I will say it's definitely a team sport, right?
Mhm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Professor Williams, as you said, you hear from folks in industry, folks in government, and academics play a really big part in solving the puzzle, the very big puzzle, the software supply chain security. There's so much work to be done. So let's get into why you all were invited here today. It was because of an amazing report that you all put out with a team of other researchers at NC State. It's called Closing the Chain: How to Reduce Your Risk of Being SolarWinds, Log4j, or XC Utils. So this was a really cool report. I really enjoyed reading it. Very essential. A great example of why academia is essential to software supply chain security right now in terms of fitting those puzzle pieces together as to how we can solve the problem. So I won't speak for you. Please take it away and tell us more about this report, the premise of it, and what led your team to ask these questions in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I was probably the initial motivation behind it all, but then Sivana took it over and excelled. And so the initial motivation was I did a sabbatical in 2022 and 2023 with Synopsys. It's now Black Duck. And in that sabbatical, created a framework called the Proactive Software Supply Chain Risk Management Framework that was intentionally the union of 10 other frameworks that industry knows about. And so It brings together all the things, in theory, people are supposed to do to reduce supply chain risk. And that came up with 73 tasks. That's a lot of things to do, and organizations can't do them all. And so there have been other frameworks, maturity models that have different ways of prioritizing, but the intention is really to prioritize based on risk reduction. How can we adopt the tasks that are most likely to mitigate what the attackers are doing? And so with that global in mind, Sivana really took it to heart and did a tremendous study. And that's where her take over.
So I guess on my end, this was like when I started my PhD, I was doing like several works. So then we were talking about like more like what I would say like my main dissertation works are going to be, which again is sort of related to that part of like what's the state of the supply chain and how could like we measure it. And from my point of view, I was actually like asking myself like, well, how can I like start measuring stuff if I don't even understand what attacks are happening, right? Or like how they actually work in detail. So I was like sort of like, well, I should actually understand these like attacks that are happening generally in a more detailed way. I guess in our case, we did like attack techniques specifically that the attackers use with CTI reports, but specifically just generally like understanding them, because it's really hard to like secure something you have no idea what's happening. So I talked with Laurie, right? And I was like, hey, I'm like sort of interesting. I think I called it like dissecting the attacks at one point, because I was sort of like, and I was like, well, we're like opening them up and seeing them. And then I went to like, well, I looked more into it, and it's like, well, it's sort of like, like when airplanes crash, you're supposed to like actually like retrospectively look at like why did this happen, like why is this catastrophe happening, right? Like looking back into it. And Laurie told me when she did her sabbatical, we had some collaborators from industry, I guess shout out to Chris and Rob, that were also sort of talking a little bit about that, like maybe you could like actually look into like big attacks, right? Specifically in our case, we looked at in the end like SolarWinds, Log4j and XEUtils, which are sort of like a trifecta of like very popular attacks. But so they had talked a little bit about that and how we could maybe use it with PSCRM, right? Being the encapsulations of all these different frameworks to understand, hey, are these frameworks actually mitigating these attacks, right? From a practitioner point of view. So I guess in this case, we benefited a lot from like having this like very close industry collaboration. Again, they're great collaborators, amazing people too, but it was very beneficial to have also their point of view and their like all their insights and experiences that helped the study. And that's, I guess, sort of where it like started overall.
Yeah.
And Chris Madden and Robert Hines of Rob Hines are from Yahoo, for the shout out to them.
We love the shout outs here. Thank you. Yeah. And Sivana, I love how you explained the importance of dissecting attacks. I think at ConversingLabs, we've talked a lot about the anatomy of a software supply chain attack. And, I definitely want to get into these three major incidents, which, our audience, they are into cybersecurity, but just to set everybody on the same stage here, these are, like the three most popular, infamous, well-known, I think consequential, or could have been more consequential, software supply chain attacks. And each is pretty distinct from one another. So as you said, looking into the anatomy of each is important. I guess in your own words, we don't have to go too deep in the weeds, but can you talk about each of these? There are a lot of weeds. Can you talk about, each of these incidents, SolarWinds, Log4j, XEUtils, and how they differ from one another?
I'll try to give a detailed, broad overview, but again, this could be like a topic of like hours, definitely. And we read so many reports. SolarWinds is at a more high level, I would say it's an attack that mostly focused on the build infrastructure. How people got into their environment is still something that at least is still not publicly disclosed, and I don't know the details. I don't have clearance. You have not told me specifically. But generally, what attackers actually did is they introduced malware called Sunspot within the SolarWinds environment. And what Sunspot would actually do is it would detect if actually they were building software with Visual Studio Code or generally. So when it noticed it was actually building the software, they introduced another malware that it's a bit more well-known, Sunburst. And Sunburst, what they would actually check that, hey, can we actually introduce Sunburst or not? Is it safe or not? They had like a lot of things they were checking. They also tested it multiple times. They didn't just put Sunburst in the first time. They were like sort of like, hey, if we change this and we tamper with the build, would someone notice this? So this process carried out through several months. And when Sunburst would be put into the software, right? It would then be built by SolarWinds. It would actually be signed as if everything was normal, right? And then dependent systems, which included U.S. government, big companies, among others, then installed Sunburst. Again, it's sort of a Trojan in their systems. And Sunburst specifically, you could like send commands to it. So the attackers could be like, hey, could you download this? That'd be really nice. Could you send me your data? That would also be pretty nice. So they would also install additional payloads in these systems. Some of them were also like specifically tailored to specific systems. They would do recon, among other stuff. So I guess that's SolarWinds in a very more general view. Log4j is a bit different in the sense that this was Log4j was an open source package by Apache. Specifically, it was developed. The feature that was vulnerable was actually developed in 2013, so it was like a long time ago, and it was a feature that was added. Again, it was just there, particularly a JNDI lookup feature. And again, this is a contributor added the feature, the team checked it, everything seemed pretty normal. And then in 2021, actually a developer, and I'm probably botching the name of the company, Alibaba, but they actually noticed that, hey, there's actually vulnerability in this feature. So they told Apache, they actually disclosed pretty nicely, and they're like, hey, just a heads up, this is sort of like, look into this, right? And then they're like, oh, we have to fix this. So they were actually trying to fix it. And what actually ended up happening is they were actually discussing in WeChat, I believe, or it's a forum, in some online forum, some POCs about Log4j, which again, Log4j is like pretty insidious because everybody uses Log4j generally. So what ended up happening is they had to publicly disclose the vulnerability before they had a full patch available or full fix available. So what ended up happening is they released the fix. Attackers actually started exploiting it when the CVE or the vulnerability was publicly disclosed. At the same time, they noticed that the fix was not very complete. Then there were other issues and some fixes added other things attackers could leverage and so on and so forth. So it became like a sort of a scramble. People didn't know if they were actually patching or not fully. It's still an issue even nowadays. Like Sonatype, which is a very big company, they also have like these reports, and there's still people who are using the vulnerable version of Log4j, like still at this point, yes. I don't know, so many years later.
And
so
there's been,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there's also been evidence that nation state-backed actors have been, exploiting this vulnerability still years later.
Well, and all of them, I guess all of these are sort of nation states. I guess in XEUtils it's not confirmed, but it's pretty suspected.
Yeah, they were quite sophisticated, which I won't steal your thunder. But
yeah. So, and I guess the last one, XEUtils, a bit different than the other ones in some other senses, right? So again, this one is an open source one, but the difference, the other Log4j was accidentally vulnerable. Really, wasn't like the developer's fault that it was vulnerable, that they introduced a feature. Particularly in XEUtils, there's actually like these sock puppet accounts that were created throughout several years, and they actually became maintainers of XEUtils, which is a package that, if you go through the dependency tree, is super important for like a lot of like packages. Particularly, they leveraged that it was used for SSHD, which is for like some Linux distributions. It like actually used that. Anyway, so they leveraged that, hey, we have this dependency that other people depend upon, and they noticed that actually XEUtils only had like one main developer. So they were like, hey, maybe we could leverage this. So they ended up in pressuring campaigns, actually pressuring the main developer at one point to give access to what ended up being a sock puppet account. That then throughout several years contributed to the software. And there's like this like well-known document that the original maintainer did like after the attack, where they actually went through all the commits, or a lot of them, and they're like, most of them were actually like legit.
Yes.
Like, they actually contributed to the software. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I only did a malware and that was it and bye, right? They actually contributed throughout multiple years, like a lot. But at one point they started to implement, in that case, again, the malware in XEUtils actually had some bugs, so it would crash sometimes. And after that, somebody, a developer, Microsoft, Andrew Schrun, I'm probably mispronouncing his name. Anyways, he actually noticed it, publicly disclosed that, hey, this vulnerability is happening. Or someone is actually like leveraging this. This seems to be malicious too at one point, because they're sort of like, hey, this is sort of weird. The binary doesn't match the one that's like there. They also leveraged that XEUtils, again, used binaries in their tests. So it would like decompress these binaries, add, do a lot of crazy stuff, like it would add and delete and move characters. It was a lot of stuff. But generally, these attacks are like pretty complex, all of them, and like pretty well known because they affected, and I guess in the case of XE utils, might have affected, right, because it was disclosed before it was leveraged, a lot of organizations worldwide.
Yeah. I think that, in choosing these three incidents, I think they were well chosen because they all focus on different areas of the supply chain, all connected to each other, of course. But, SolarWinds being more closed source, Log4j, as you said, it wasn't necessarily an intentional malicious effort at first, but was exploited as a software vulnerability. And then the last one, XE utils, I think really speaks to the current threat landscape now with open source software being heavily targeted, in addition to, which I definitely want to get into later, is how a lot of the folks that uphold open source are volunteers, these maintainers. And in that case with XE utils, that was totally taken advantage of, right? Great job with that very succinct overview, but very, very well delivered. Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Williams, anything you want to add on that?
Great job. Great job.
Yeah. Oh, yes, you did. So Professor Williams, I know that you spoke a little bit about the frameworks that were involved in this study. There were 10 frameworks, including one that you authored. Can you just tell us a bit more about that breakdown in terms of the frameworks? Some come from government, some come from open source, others from industry, academia, of course. Just give us an overview, please, of those 10 and how they differ, how they compare, what they mean for companies today trying to secure their supply chains.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, PeaceFrame is the union of 10 frameworks, not intending to be the 11th framework, but to be the union by definition. And as you mentioned, those frameworks come from the US government, so some NIST frameworks. Cloud Native has a framework, and on supply chain security, and SALSA and OpenSSF have frameworks. The executive order 14028 that came out in April 2021 had a self-attestation framework. And so in coming up with the union, there was an explicit choice to bring together frameworks that dealt with software supply chain security, not general security. So things like NIST 853 or ISO 27001 were not involved because they're very general. So it was really focused on software supply chain security. And with that, I mean, you would think, why 10? How many different looks are there at software supply chain security? And they were chosen not only because of their relation to software supply chain security, but each actually has a different focus. So for example, NIST 800-161 it's about supply chain security, hardware and software supply chain security, but it especially has tasks related to governance, so vendor management and policy that the others didn't have. SSDF, NIST SSDF, that gets lots of publicity.
Secure Software Development Framework, just to break down the acronym.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
And the D in there is development. And so the key there is that in our frame, in our different categories or different practices in PeaceFrame, they especially populated the product grouping, the product practice. That's the development, that's the software engineering practice. And so SSDF especially was influential there. And then the other two practices in PeaceFrame are environment, which are IT related, and deployment, which is the deployment, but PCERT, things like that. And the Cloud Native framework and the SALSA framework specialize in those areas. And so we do have a grid that talks about, where did all of the 73 come from, which are overlap, which of the frameworks like a task only appeared in one framework, and which are the most influential. So I would say they really were synergistically brought together into PeaceFrame. And then from that framework, Sivana really was able to structure her work.
Yeah. Thank you for that overview. And I think that you also point out a really important aspect here, which is software supply chain security isn't meant to be solved by one team within an organization.
Yes.
You point out that it spans from, the governance risk compliance piece, all the way going to the left to developers, which, that's a whole other podcast topic in itself of how developers can get more onto it, which we have talked about before on the podcast, to everything in between, right? So I think rightfully so important to have a selection of frameworks that focus on those different areas of the supply chain.
Right. And bring them together. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's get into the fun part, which is the results of your study, which were, really fascinating. Definitely don't want to steal the thunder again here, but overall, after, looking at over 100 cyber threat intelligence CTI reports, of the 3 attacks that we talked about, SolarWinds, Log4j, XeUtils, comparing those with Professor Williams, as you said, the 73 tasks throughout the frameworks, what did you find? How were these frameworks matching up with the different mitigation techniques that organizations need to be taking?
So I guess adding to what we found, I guess general findings, because there's a lot of things we found, but on the task side mostly. First of all, we had when we did these mappings, we actually generated something we called a starter kit. So we ranked different tasks in these different frameworks, right? And we're okay, based on these attacks, you would mitigate these amount of attack techniques. Oh, adding to that, I think we forgot to mention, we mapped all these CTI reports to MITRE ATT&CK, which is a pretty well-known framework for TTPs. Particularly in our case, attack techniques, right, described how attackers did stuff. So we mapped those attack techniques to PSCRM, which included these software supply chain attacks. And from the reports, we had, okay, what are all these attack techniques? What are all these tests? And we created a mapping between them. And based on that, then we had okay, let's rank the tasks within PSCRM, right, and find which are the most prominent ones that you're supposed to do if you wanted to defend your supply chain. And for the top 3, we found it was actually access control, system monitoring, and boundary protection. Actually, if you look at the top 10, because again, we sort of did a top 10, sort of an OAuth top 10 type of thing. But we actually found they're very more software security related rather than software supply chain related, which initially we were sort of that's interesting. I expected I was going to get, yeah.
Not to interrupt you, but I am curious, could you just define quickly for our audience, maybe this is a can of worms that is a lot to open up, but software security in comparison to software supply chain security?
I guess so I guess software supply chain security, right, obviously is part of software security, right? I guess software security, I would say it is more broad. I think Laurie would probably have a better definition than me. And I feel software supply chain security is a specific area that we focus on specific types of attacks that prey upon you depending upon the software. That's what I would say specifically. But having a good software security posture is what we found, I guess, related to this, was having a good software supply chain security posture.
Yeah, and I guess I can add to that in that software security, so that's what I've been teaching for lots of years, is the intersection of software engineering and security. So how do you build a secure product? And there are a lot of things we've been doing for a long time, scanning for vulnerabilities or doing security design or things like that have been being done for a long time. And then along comes these new types of attacks and new things that have to be done specifically for supply chain.
Understood. Yeah, I think too, not to just throw us off here, but a lot of what you just said, Professor Williams, is very reminiscent of, secure by design, which, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I believe they put out 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. My concept of time is not great, but really applies to those principles. So thanks for breaking that down. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Professor Williams, on maybe when that came out, how it impacted the industry, just as a quick side bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll isolate some specific tasks. So things that are new, if you will, can be updating your components when they're vulnerable, or managing vulnerable components. So, just and choosing your components. So not just taking anything off of anywhere, but actually making explicit choices. So those are just, 3 examples. There are others that were not on the scene before that are on the scene now.
Gotcha. Thank you. Sivana, I'll let you continue with
So I guess it's
that question.
yeah. So I guess we had these top 10 again, mostly are sort of like general good software security things. It did include some extra stuff that was more software supply chain security, like, hey, you should update your dependencies if there's actually a vulnerable version, among others. But again, they're mostly focused on like more broad software security. Again, initially I was a bit taken aback when we ran our results and I was like, oh, that's a bit weird to me. But then I was like, well, it's sort of hard to secure your, well, we hypothesize again why we got this. It might be sort of hard to secure your supply chain if you're not doing like access control or if you have a good access control posture, right? So we were like, maybe it's that, maybe all these like newer tasks that are more on our radar now, they might be very forward looking. So again, how we like created our mapping, they had to be sort of like agreed upon tasks. So it might be that. Again, it was somewhat interesting. I would say that's main finding one, sort of this starter kit of like what people should do. Also, another interesting thing is like on our starter kit too, we had tasks from different parts of the, like as Laurie explained, right? There's like different groups in Peacecrum, right? So we had tasks from governance, we had tasks from product, we had tasks from the environment, and we had tasks from like deployment that were in the top 10 really of what you should do. So again, it's sort of like, so we all, I think this is a sort of well-known thing in security that you have to have a defense in depth, right? You can't like focus only on like your product or only on the environment or only on deployment, right? Or only on governance, right? It's a thing that goes across everybody. So that was also it. Then we also have like different metrics we created for frameworks. So we had like coverage and completeness and all that. And that was basically if they mapped to like stuff that was within the framework that was referenced in Peacecrum. General findings, again, this is somewhat expected that like no framework was gonna like cover all these attacks. As Laurie mentioned before, every framework has a different view of the slice of the supply chain, right? So again, I guess we don't really expect any framework to fully like encapsulate everything, but I guess that was somewhat like interesting that we had that too. Yes, adding to that, I don't know, you can interrupt me whenever.
No.
Because there's a lot of cool findings. The frameworks that did better off based on our metrics again was actually the U.S. government frameworks that we had generally. So NIST SSCS, NIST 800-161, even the self-attestation form, which I was very surprised. The form, because again, it was sort of like, what are these basic software security tasks that people should do? Mm-hmm. And I guess the final interesting, more main finding that we had generally, we also, when we were analyzing these different CTI reports, we were like mapping manually. I guess shout out to Jacob Bowen. We were like manually mapping these different reports. And when we were mapping them too, we were trying to map them if they had a task that they mentioned, and we would map those tasks to Peacecrum, if that makes sense. So basically based on that, what we were able, like we had like tasks that we found in these different CTI reports that were not in Peacecrum. So we found these tasks that we call like gap tasks that we were not able to like map at all. We discussed these like tasks with our group multiple times. Some tasks just became a little bit bigger. So for example, dependency update, something that was a task that people talked a lot about coming from executils was sort of like flighting, right? Of like waiting a bit when you're updating your dependency. So there was a dependency update task, but we increased that. But there's some other stuff that was not mentioned in like any frameworks, like supporting open source software was not mentioned really explicitly in any of these frameworks, or also having
and
like
that's a big one.
I know, yeah, I know. Environmental scanning tools. So generally having tools that are scanning like your environment, sort of like similar to how you have like your SaaS and DaaS for your product, but having more specific tools for your environment, and then sort of building these response partnerships that are super valuable before an attack happens. Because when an attack happens, you want to have like a group or network that you can like collaborate and like build upon, rather than just being like alone and sad.
Alone and sad is a good way to describe it. After the fact.
After an attack.
Yeah. Well, I think, really, I mean, thank you for that breakdown. And really the big takeaway here is, just at a high level, at the end of the day, if you look at these 10 frameworks and, as you said, each framework wasn't meant to solve every single problem, every single risk that the software supply chain presents. But overall, if organizations apply all 73 tasks in a perfect world, all 73 tasks of these 10 frameworks, at the end of the day, they would still be vulnerable to the kinds of software supply chain attacks, SolarWinds, Log4j, XE-utils. So that's a pretty big finding, to say. I am curious. And Professor Williams, would love for you to jump in here too, since you're pretty in depth with these frameworks. Why do you think these big areas of open source software scanning and environmental scanning tools, why were they left out?
Yeah, I mean, all I could say is, they tried their best. And when we fully intend, to continue the work that Sivana was doing. And, we're into the Peace Corps version 2. And when we get that webpage out, we'll list the orphans. And we'll list those 3, and we will encourage the framework authors to include those orphans, I'll call them, I don't know if that's the right word, in their frameworks, because we don't want to be the 11th framework or the 16th framework. We want to be the union. And so, but we want to highlight when a framework didn't do something. And, we have the traceability from what Sivana did. Like, this is why we think this is a problem. Look at this specific report on XZ or on SolarWinds and what they did and how this could have helped. And so it's just a continuing evolution, and we see our role in being able to help organizations prioritize their task adoption, because they can't do them all, but also to help the framework authors to see maybe some blind spots they have.
Exactly. Yeah, a way for them to move forward. 100%. And going off of that, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the report has been out since the summertime, or was it released later?
I guess summer. I guess maybe it was May. I don't, around there, maybe April. Okay. I guess.
So it's been out in the universe for a while now. I'm curious, have you had feedback from industry partners that you all are connected with so far regarding the research?
Yes. I don't know why Sivana made me.
I'm shy. I guess.
We did some popular press is what I'll call it, reaction. And, we've also, I've taken Sivana out on the roadshow for work, and whenever we possibly can, to industry and government organizations. And so have gotten some great feedback. And, without saying the agency, there was one U.S. government agency that said, like, this is great. We were trying to figure out how to prioritize task adoption, and mitigating the things attackers doing now is a great way to do it. We're going to do these 10, and so that's exactly the type of reaction that we wanted to have.
Yes, overall very positive. Sort of like nerve-wracking when you do like studies like these and like talking to people who actually like are like pretty well known and know about these attacks, and like overall I think we'd had a pretty positive reception of like these study, and like hopefully people can like contribute more. And again, we're planning to continuing to do this and like gather more data of like how can we actually like stop these attacks or like other security outcomes generally, and how can we automate what we did, because again, a lot of what we did was very manually intensive. It was very hard process, and hopefully what we would like to do is like over time continue to like do this and like ingest information, what's happening, hopefully as close as real time as possible. So those are like exciting, I guess, research directions that we are like looking at.
Yeah, we have, as Sivana mentioned, particularly the digesting CTI and mapping it to the MITRE attack was very labor intensive. And there's a number of papers and studies with automating that process, CTI ingestion to MITRE attack mapping, and none of them perform well. And so that's one of the things that we're really working on right now. And we have some promising approach that hopefully we'll be publishing in February of next year that can automate that process. And then we should be able to take, some of the newest attacks and the CTI from those, and to find out what are the attacker techniques and map them to mitigations and perform this prioritization.
Nice. Yeah. And I know too that I believe MITRE attack just put out a new update regarding its framework. So very important too to jump on that in terms of automation. Automation really is going to help cybersecurity in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So well said.
Imagine that we're using an LLM.
Yep. So should we have a whole other podcast now on what your thoughts are on AI and cybersecurity? Do you guys have another hour? Maybe 3. So I think also too, you all brought up a good point and ties in well to my next question. So there have been, of course, other supply chain attacks that are quite notable. One I'll bring up is the attack on the voice over internet protocol provider 3CX, which, correct me if I'm wrong, probably like similar in nature to the SolarWinds incident of 2020. And then looking to this year specifically, open source software has been hit tremendously. For instance, the Shai-Hulud worm that took over NPM not too long ago. That was a really big incident. I'm curious how, looking at these attacks and other supply chain attacks that I have not brought up, do the, attack patterns that you have looked at in your research going to SolarWinds, XeUtils, Log4j, how do they compare to these other incidents? And are there other messages and lessons from these attacks that maybe SolarWinds and XeUtils and Log4j didn't speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I think without actually doing the detailed work, we can't really comment. And I'll say that, and I'll put Sivana on the spot. Of the 3 that you did, there were some techniques that were in all 3.
Yeah, on all 3.
So,
I remember one was something subvert trust controls, because again, that's very like something that's like elemental of all these attacks. I think there's a lot of things that it was sort of okay. Well, there's a supply chain attack technique that's like supply chain. So that one definitely like was part of like all the attacks. There's some other ones. I remember there's obfuscation, I believe, that was part of all the attacks too. Because attackers, when they get into these systems, basically they try to like hide to stay longer and then do more stuff. I think in the paper we do have like the 12 that are there. There might be overlap with the attack techniques again in these new attacks. Maybe there's not. I think it's sort of interesting to know how do they like compare what's like this broad set of stuff. I guess without going into the whole detail of like these attacks and doing like this whole manual work would be sort of hard to say. Like I've read about these attacks in a broad level, and I guess I have some thoughts about them. But again, it's sort of hard without doing the whole like approach and like a level or like a high. Yeah.
Yeah, so there would, I'm sure, it be overlap, but then there may be some unique things that, because we all have generally a high level overview of what those attacks were, but when you get into the details, there may be some unique things.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's exciting to hear that you want to continue this research and, looking at automation, because as attacks continue to happen, because they will, you can, do your magic and we can like looking forward to seeing those results. So this is really the $1 million question here for you both that I have in regards to what now, right? So we have this great research that you all put out regarding, what these frameworks missed, what are the most important mitigation tactics that organizations need to take. But, as Professor Williams, I think you pointed out in the beginning, it's a lot for organizations to apply software supply chain security practices, from these frameworks. And I think oftentimes with the speed of software development, the speed of business, it can be a disincentive for software producers to care about these things, to implement them. So if you were a so-called cyber czar and you had the power to incentivize software firms to invest in the necessary resources to secure their pipelines and their supply chains, how would you go about it? Does it, matter if there are legal mandates? Would that help the issue? Or are there other ways to compel security investments for software producers?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'll say I do think it's government regulations.
Gotcha.
We saw the biggest jump, like, I was working with organizations, like I did some assessments on Peace Scrum assessments during my sabbatical, and it was the executive order and the need to self-attest that caused organizations to all of a sudden have a supply chain security department. Without that, they wouldn't have had that. And yes, there's exponential growth in supply chain security attacks. So it's not that people would have done nothing, but because of the need, if you want to sell to the U.S. government, you need to attest, and everyone jumped on. And then the European CRA is again generating a reaction. So I just think that those types of things have to happen for people to really take it seriously.
Yeah. Sivana, anything you want to add? If you were cyber czar,
I
how would you
guess
deal with
we
it?
hope to help a little bit with the data side of like having data that hopefully motivates a bit more, but I feel like regulation is it seems to be also, I guess, from my less like my fewer experience overall, but it does seem like it's good. I think it's at least in our space, the good thing is like there's a lot of I feel like there's a lot of feedback that you can give to like these frameworks and standards, like how to make them better too. I guess if you're like interested in that. But overall it does feel like sort of like mandates are helping, I guess, drive progress.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you said, Executive Order 14028. I hope I got the numbers right.
Yeah, you're good.
I've seen it so many times, I better remember
Yeah.
it now. That really, as you said, was a catalyst for folks caring about software supply chain security. And, before that, SolarWinds, of course. So, the proof is in the pudding, as the saying goes. So just to be mindful of your time, I know, we've talked about a lot of great things. Is there anything else before we close out today that you two wanted to talk about that I didn't get the chance to ask you that you want to share with our audience? Any key takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is just an invitation to collaborate with us at NC State. We do have a large National Science Foundation research center. And as part of that, and really, we always want to ground our work. Software supply chain security is a practical problem that's affecting the world. And so we can't be in the ivory tower doing our research without collaborating with companies. And so if it's interesting for you to work with us, we would love to work with you. Some of the ways, we have 3 software supply chain summits per year where we sit down with organizations and share with each other what their challenges are, what their approaches are, and we're the flies on the wall listening for research ideas. We have a community day, which is next week annually, and we do Peace Scrum assessment. So we'll work with an organization and assess where you are and give you a gap analysis and compare you to other companies. If people are familiar with BSIM, it's really that type of an assessment. But even in general, if there's some research topic you think we should be looking at, we would love to hear from you.
Well
And I
said.
guess on my end, again, thank you for the invite overall. I think it's really cool, I guess, for us as academics and I think industry, government and open source to like collaborate overall. I think we all benefit from this, right? I guess also like adding to like apart from what we do, I know like OpenSSF is like a pretty big group and I don't think we had like that much time to talk about like open source software and like the big role it plays. But I think that's sort of like, like important to like bring up. They have a ton of great initiatives. I mean, we work I guess with a lot of people knows OpenSSF and we try, like overall, like just helping generally. Uh, I think the supply chain is like at the end of the day, it's a problem that's sort of created because we all depend upon each other by definition in a way, by theory. So it's not only a problem that
Yes.
we can solve also if we like all collaborate with each other. And again, hopefully if you have any interesting problems, you can also contact us because yeah, we're super excited to always work with industry, government, or open source.
Yes. I know. I think that one of my favorite parts about working in cybersecurity and software supply chain security in particular is the people, right? The community is really awesome, connecting with others in the community, sharing those ideas, especially folks at OpenSSF, Linux Foundation, OWASP. There's so many great organizations out there, folks like you in academia, and then also looking at industry and government. It's really important that, as I said earlier, it is a team sport, of course. And for those interested in, reading the report, learning more about Professor Williams and Sivana, we'll go ahead and link everything you need to know in our show notes once this podcast is produced and put out. And we'll also share all of that on our socials as well. So Professor Williams and Sivana Hamer, thank you so much for joining us today on the Conversing Labs podcast. It was a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, well, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our work.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's pretty fun.
Of course. Yeah, of course. We'll see you all next time. Thank you so much for joining us